right. And can you see my little, the visual?
I love it. I love it.
Awesome. Good. So the topic of today's talk, as you guys know, is how to achieve and sustain peak mental performance. And just so that, this doesn't get anybody dizzy, I'm just going to go ahead and switch off to my next slide. But essentially, when we talk about peak performance, right, most of us are familiar with peak performance that comes from studies and observations and practices that professional athletes use, and high achieving individuals in the kind of sports area. But in the context of this talk today, and really our conversation, we're specifically talking about peak mental performance, and really a kind of performance that's not only peak, but we're able to sustain it. It's not like we reach this thing and then we immediately go down, but how do we really create this level of cognitive functioning, emotional regulation, being in the flow, in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's nurturing to us, and in a way that ultimately gets us the desired results. So I'll just share a definition that I came across that I thought was very good at encapsulating kind of what we're referring to as peak performance. So it's a state in which the person performs to their maximum ability, right? So really doing the best that we can at any given moment. And it's characterized by feelings of confidence, generally by positive feelings about ourselves and about the world around us. This sense of effortlessness, although that's a little bit of a misnomer, but really more of just that, again, things are in the flow, and then total focus on the task at hand, right? And so the way that I broke this down for the purpose of our talk today, just so that we can discuss it and break down the topic, as I like to do, in an organized way, we're going to talk about the two different elements of mental performance. One of them is, of course, the cognitive performance, which in neuroscience terms refers to our global cognition, our ability to pay attention, our ability to learn and to retrieve memory, our executive function and planning, visuospatial and visual construction ability. So where we are in space, our planning with respect to space, our psychomotor speed, right? The speed at which we react, and then our language and verbal. So the use of language, verbal recall, and so on. And then there's mental health component, which contributes to our mental performance and to our cognitive performance as well, which really includes, by the psychology terms, our emotional, psychosocial, and social well-being, right? So our social well-being, meaning our interactions with the world around us socially, but then also our ability to regulate emotions, as well as our psychological health and well-being. And then, because I mentioned the flow, and because this is something that I certainly consider to be very important when we talk about peak performance, specifically as it relates to how we're performing at work or how we're performing in any kind of cognitive tasks, really the perfect conditions for attaining that flow are, as you can see here, and I think you guys are able to see my arrow, but really being at the top of our skill level and at the top of our challenge level. And our skill and challenge, of course, are matched. And this is kind of entering that flow state where we can fully devote our focus to something. We lose track of time. We're totally immersed in what we're doing, and we're producing our best work. Have you guys ever experienced something like this at work, or maybe in a creative endeavor, whether you play music, whether you do art, whether you're writing something or working on a particular project, that kind of state of flow? And doesn't it feel so good? Yeah. And isn't it good if we can reproduce it and figure out how to do it again and again and again? So we'll talk about some conditions that are required for us to be in the flow. Some of these conditions we can directly regulate, and other conditions are somewhat dependent on the circumstances of, again, the work at hand. But notice how here, when we're at the other extremes, right, we have high skill level, but we're not being challenged enough, right? We're zen, and it's okay to drop from flow to being in that zen state and from feeling fully relaxed or from this sense of being in control, but then we're not using that maximum potential. And that's okay. We don't always have to be running at that 100% speed, but just notice how these different levels of engagements are possible and they exist. And then, of course, as you notice here, we have the other type of mismatch where our skill level in that particular task that we're doing happens to be low, or maybe when we're in the process of learning and we just haven't gotten to practice something enough times and the challenge level is really high, we get very anxious, right? And that's not when we produce our best work. So before I continue, and maybe just because there are 5 of us on the call right now, before I continue, because we're going to cover many different aspects of our cognitive health as well as our mental health as they relate to our mental performance, I want you to think about, and if you feel comfortable, share, are there any specific elements of your cognitive and mental health that you're wanting to work on, improve, optimize in your life right now? So let's say you want to work on improving your memory, or maybe you want to work on how do I better focus on my task at hand and not, and avoid multitasking, or how do I work on controlling my emotions a little bit better, or impulsivity or whatnot. So you can, again, think about it internally, you can write it down, and then if you feel comfortable, feel free to share, and I will not pick on you. I just think it's helpful when we share, because then we can kind of really dive deep into these areas as well. Any shares? And that's okay if not. Okay, sounds good.
I can share. Sorry.
Oh, okay, sure, Allie, go ahead.
So my biggest challenge right now is not overthinking things. I know that when I don't do that, that is when I feel like I'm in a flow and like controlled, and I feel like, I don't know, like more powerful or something. But I do tend to get lost in the overthinking to the point where people point it out to me. It's like a flaw of mine, which, I mean, it's good to have people around me who will be like, you're doing it again.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my biggest challenge, I think, right now.
And thank you for sharing that. And do you think it comes usually when I hear this, it usually comes, and by the way, I also get into those states and I'm like, okay, how do I, but usually when I hear this, it usually has to do with worrying about the outcome of something so much that the overthinking is almost giving you a certain sense of control. Is that what you think it is? Or being
Yeah, I worry a lot about disappointing people or letting them down. And so I think that's the root of where that comes from.
Got it. Yeah, about disappointing or letting people down. And so you're overthinking, overanalyzing. How can I do something differently? How do I talk to that person? Maybe how do I? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, what's the perfect plan for the future? And if it's not perfect, then I get lost in all the details instead of just doing.
The big picture. Okay, great. So it sounds to me like it might be helpful to to then, and we'll cover this as well, but it sounds to me like it might be helpful to kind of go through some exercises of relaxation and self-reflection, where perhaps you get curious about those triggers for overthinking. You get curious about, where did that come from? That thought that I might be letting someone down, or that thought about really, really wanting to please, where you're so focused on it. I think that could be a good opportunity for that reflection and that curiosity, so that you could maybe dig a little bit deeper into those thought habits and into those beliefs, so that you can work on challenging, maybe some of those beliefs, which then ultimately, as you challenge those beliefs and thought habits, you can challenge the overthinking and the worrying. And then because oftentimes our first instinct is to suppress, right? And to go, nope, I don't want to go there. But then it just comes back. And so working from underneath it to see what's beneath the surface, it sounds like that could be really helpful as a first step at the very least. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. We'll definitely touch on some points to help here. So just before I get off of the topic of flow, because I think it really is very tightly connected to that peak and that optimal mental performance, I do want to address how to create flow. And so, and as you may know, this concept of flow comes from a positive psychologist whose name I am not brave enough to pronounce. I haven't practiced it enough times, but here's a set of proposed strategies and factors that need to be met in order for flow to be created. So as we mentioned, the challenge and skill need to be balanced. High challenge, high skill, we're right on track for flow. Action and awareness merging. So being aware of our actions, being aware of the task at hand, of what we're doing, what's going on within us as well as outside us. Having very clear goals that we're setting. And I believe we had talked about SMART goals before, and I think this is a concept that you guys are familiar with, right? So very, very clear goals. Getting clear feedback, right? Because feedback can be very helpful in terms of self-correcting and or even just positive feedback of knowing that, okay, great, I'm on the right track. That you then continue that state of flow. Focus or concentration on the task, of course. There's also this really important element of control. It's been shown that people are more likely to be in a state of flow if they have a sense of control over what they're doing and over themselves, right? If you have a sense that somebody, whether it's your boss, whether it's your client, that somebody is controlling you, it's really hard to get into that state of flow because you're then constantly under stress, pressure, and anxiety. And so it's less likely to get into that state. There's also something else that happens, and a lot of the literature that talks about creativity and flow and like artists being lost in their paintings, and they lose this sense of time and they lose this sense of ego, this self-consciousness. So as you were mentioning, Ali, that, desire to please, that is almost like an implied result that will happen because you're so immersed in the task, but then the worries kind of go away in a sense, because there's this loss of ego, loss of what's gonna happen if so and so isn't pleased, or if I'm not able to meet this goal, right? You're really in that moment. And that's partly really that transformation of time or losing track of time. And then of course it has to be an enjoyable and motivating experience. So if we're talking about work specifically, and if we're talking about work tasks, we got to ultimately enjoy what we're doing. Our heart has to be in it. We have to be aligned with it, right? All right. So what about elements of peak performance then? So I wrote down a number of things here that some were from the literature, some were from my observations, from patients, from that I'll just share with you, and feel free to, to just kind of write down on or mentally relate to whatever is the most significant to you right now. But again, from that broad topic of mental and cognitive health, mindset is really important, right? That positive mindset, that self-esteem, mood, right? And we're going to talk about regulating mood and emotions and working with anxiety and depression and so on, right? Because if our mood isn't regulated, if our mood isn't stable, we're not going to be at our peak performance. There's no way. That's a prerequisite in order to achieve that mental performance. We have to regulate our autonomic nervous system. This is our sympathetic and our parasympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic is our fight or flight, where if a threat comes towards us, we run away or we fight it, or actually there's the freeze element too, where we just, do nothing and we kind of are paralyzed in a sense. And then there's the parasympathetic nervous system, which in very, very simplified terms is our rest and digest part of the nervous system that promotes relaxation, promotes digestion, promotes a calm state. And so we've got to balance these two, and I'm going to talk about how to do that. Attention, right? So attention to the present moment, avoiding multitasking. We're going to do a fun multitasking exercise as well. And then deciding where we put our energy and our time, right? So again, this goes back to alignment with our purpose. And some of these, as you can tell, and I'll talk about a lot of scientific studies, but some of these are more sort of tangible and we can study them, we can measure them. And other areas are really more of like, does my heart feel aligned? Does my mind feel aligned? Am I in my purpose? Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing, right? So we have both that need to be present in order for us to achieve that mental performance. And then there's an element of creativity. And I'll talk about, it's interesting, there have been some studies on creativity and mental performance and cognition, as well as even preventing cognitive decline in older age. So engaging in creative activities totally outside of what you're doing for work is actually really, really important for your brain. There's this sense of like feeling motivated and inspired. Social connection, of course, is very important when it comes to our mental health. A lot of people find that connection to something greater and a form of or practice of spirituality is also important in order to cultivate that sense of purpose and that sense of like the big why. Why am I doing what I'm doing, right? And we kind of talk about that, knowing your why. And then drive and interest in the task, right? Brain health physiology, we'll talk a little bit about that. How do we optimize our brain health? Single tasking as opposed to multitasking. Having that growth mindset specifically, where if let's say we're doing something and somebody points out an error that we made, or we notice that like, oh, look, our peers are much better at this than I am, rather than saying, oh no, I'm a failure, throwing our hands up, really knowing that, oh, great, this is an opportunity. This is, if I practice this, if I work on it and pay attention to it, I will get better. And it's a learning opportunity. So looking at areas of weakness or areas of so-called failure as true learning opportunities. And a lot of studies have been done in athletes as well as in students, where if they go in with that growth mindset and the mindset of like, okay, if I practice, if I pay attention to this thing that's a weakness that I need to strengthen, I will get better and I will get stronger. And so there's study after study showing the benefits of that growth mindset. There's the gut-brain connection piece, where in part what goes on in our gut affects our brain and vice versa. And then how we then stressors around us and how we react to them. And I'm going to talk a little bit about stress just because it's such a kind of ubiquitous component of our environment. And then the physical elements of peak performance: sleep, nutrition, movement, our ability to detox, and restoration or restorative activities. So I'm going to talk about some of these as well as they relate to mental performance. Okay. So how do we measure mental performance, right? There's a lot of people talk about peak performance, or whether it's take this supplement to improve your performance, or do this to improve your performance. But what does that really mean? Well, when I talk about that mental performance, and when I talk about studies that I will share with you over the course of the talk, generally the way that mental performance is measured is there are certain standardized tasks, certain questionnaires, and certain questions related to various aspects of our cognition, of our memory, of our ability to recall, of our ability to learn, and so on. There are certain games as well. So there are a number of tools used in neuroscience and psychology research that can really quantify mental performance or cognitive ability. And then there's neuroimaging. There are some, I'll mention some really interesting studies where we can see what parts of the brain are more active, or what parts of the brain grow new connections in response to certain tasks and habits. And then EEG studies where we measure electrical activity in the brain. And that also can point to, again, certain predisposition and certain states in our brain as well. So those are just some of the ways in which we can measure performance, just for the purpose of kind of knowing where this research is coming from. Now, I'll just share with you a bit of a roadmap for the rest of our talk. So we'll talk a bit about mental health, because this is a huge component of how we perform. And without good mental health and mental hygiene, we are just not going to be performing at our optimal level. And so we'll talk about stress, mood, anxiety, and then as well as kind of fulfilling those psychological, emotional, social, and spiritual components of well-being. And then we'll talk about physical health, which, as I mentioned, we'll just kind of talk about some of the three really basic pillars: nutrition, movement, and sleep. The detox and gut health we'll leave for another talk. Maybe that's our next one. We'll talk a little bit about supplements, and then I'll mention a couple of really interesting modalities that have some positive research behind them: neurofeedback and biofeedback, which are two different brain training methods. Is anybody familiar with those, just out of curiosity? Neurofeedback and biofeedback? No? Okay. And then habits, right? So our thought habits, our judgment habits, our feelings habits. So all of these are going to be really important in addressing our peak performance. So just to talk a little bit about stress, because this is something that that does impact our well-being. So as you can see, the majority of people are stressed. All age groups are stressed. People are stressed about all sorts of things. That's kind of the bottom line from this graph. So 71% of Americans have symptoms of stress. So it may be anxiety or feeling nervous. It could be anger, irritability, or even feeling fatigue. That's another way of manifesting stress, our response to stress. And then stress in the workplace. This is a study from the UK, actually. And it would be really interesting to see how this has changed with COVID, right? And a lot of people doing at least a big chunk of work from home, or maybe all of their work from home, and how that really affects our stress levels. For a lot of, I will say, for a lot of my patients who work from home, stress has been much lower in a way, because they get to manage their time better. They get to hear a lot of, I can manage my time better. I can prep my meals at home. There are a lot of benefits to that. But then I also hear from other people, I don't get to interact with people as much. And that's really stressful as well, because we need that human interaction as well, as we mentioned. Now, what about burnout, right? And burnout really occurs when I think about that graph of flow, where we think about ability versus challenge. I believe that burnout really occurs when we're at the constant high challenge and at the constant maybe low to intermediate ability, right? So we're constantly being asked or ask of ourselves to do things that are really, really, really challenging, and we have a hard time completing these and doing these tasks. And then eventually we burn out when we're constantly expected to perform right here. And unfortunately, about 20% of highly engaged employees are at risk of burnout. That's the estimate. And how can burnout present? Well, it can present as depression, anxiety, as anger, irritability, wanting to isolate, kind of feeling detached, or feeling a sense of apathy, like I don't care, loss of hope, and difficulty with sleep. So again, something that's super important to address if it starts to come up. Of course, the earlier we address it, the better we'll be able to address it. And then what about anxiety and depression? Well, both are very, very common. So anxiety occurs in almost 1 in 3 adults over the course of their lifetime in the US. And mood disorder, meaning depression or a different mood disorder, occur in more than 1 in 5 adults in the US over the course of their lifetime. And then stress, interestingly, accounts for 75 to 90% of all doctors' visits. So in some way or another, most of the doctors' visits are related to stress. So I just wanted to share this graph with you before we go into further strategies as to how to deal with anxiety and burnout and stress. And I think this is a nice visual that I actually learned at my mindfulness stress reduction class. If you imagine that this middle circle is, or this smallest circle is comfort, and then right outside it is our area of challenge. We're thriving, we're learning new things, we're applying ourselves in meaningful ways, right? And then beyond challenge is this area of overwhelm, right? We're overstretching ourselves. We're not getting any time to repair or restore. We're not getting any joy, really. We're just constantly high stress, overwhelmed. So what generally happens, right? If we get to this stage of overwhelm and we're constantly stretched and stretched and stretched, and there are more and more demands on us, sooner or later, we're going to reach that burnout state. There's no question. It's just that we all have different thresholds for when we reach it and how we respond to it. It is really important, if you recognize this in yourself or in a colleague that you feel comfortable talking to not only just step it back to the challenge level, but to step it back all the way to the comfort zone. Because it's really, really, really important that if we've been running at this high pace that exceeds our capacity at a given time frame, to go back and to reach for and ask for comfort. So whether that's asking for support from your loved ones, from support from a counselor, support in terms of nourishing food, getting more sleep, making time for meditation, and maybe doing a little bit less work. It's really important to not go from overwhelm to challenge, but overwhelm always has to go down to comfort. And oftentimes I'll hear this from people when they've been at a very high pace job or at a very high pace life. They wonder, oh no, why after years of this am I now chronically fatigued? I have brain fog and achy symptoms and a number of other symptoms. Well, it's likely because they never went down to comfort. And now our body is literally screaming at them saying, you've got to go back to comfort. And so ideally, obviously, we don't want to reach that stage. We want to go to comfort when it's time so we can repair, restore, and then flip right back up to the challenge. So I'm going to start by talking about mindfulness again in our context of optimizing our cognitive capacity and our mental health. And the reason is that there is a huge body of evidence supporting mindfulness because it's free. You can do it on your own by yourself at any time. And it's something that's really accessible to everyone. It really requires time commitment and dedication. But other than that, it's very accessible. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is a cultivation of an awareness that we achieve by paying attention in a very intentional way. So paying attention on purpose in the present moment of whatever may be going on. It could be while we're reading a book, paying attention to what we're doing in that time. It could be while we're cooking. It could be while we're working, while we're having an interaction, whether it's a positive, negative, whatever the label is. But paying attention, being aware in that moment, being aware of our thoughts, maybe being aware of our judgments of ourselves. And it's really important to have an awareness of not judging, or at least having an awareness of when we are judging as we're paying attention to that moment. So this is one of the ways in which we can cultivate mindfulness and which we can meditate. And meditation is something, or mindfulness, I should say, is something that can be done during meditation, but it's also something we can do right now or at any time really over the course of your day. It really is just that paying attention, right? Oftentimes, if let's say, we're writing an email and we're eating and we're doing, right? It's pretty mindless because we're like switching from task to task. We're not paying attention. So mindfulness is really being aware and paying attention on purpose in that moment. So let's break down what the things mean. So paying attention, right? So where attention goes, energy flows, right? So if we decide to focus on the bad or on something negative, that's where energy is going to go. So we're going to feel mental and physical fatigue, very likely. We're going to feel drained. So really choosing what we pay our attention to. And one of the ways that we can train our body and mind to do that is by starting to pay attention to things that are pretty basic and are kind of happening anyway. So number one, our breath, right? Our breathing is just going to happen whether we pay attention to it or not. But what we can do is we can tune into our breath and have a sense of, are we breathing in a shallow way or are we breathing deeply, right? And then sensation in our body. So let's say we get aches and pains, or let's say we're feeling really excited. Where does that feel? Does it feel in your chest area? Do you feel it in your stomach? Do you get butterflies? So feeling those sensations. Do you have a headache? It's okay to tune into, again, the positively perceived and the kind of negatively perceived sensations. And then paying attention to our feelings and thoughts, right? So oftentimes, if we have positive feelings and thoughts, we kind of like to daydream and it's nice. And then if we're having negative feelings and thoughts, we're more prone to trying to kind of like suppress them. And so this is really where the problem arises, because the more we suppress, the more it's just going to pop up. And I often hear from patients, let's say they're new to the meditation practice and they have this idea that, well, meditation is going to make me feel good, right? Well, not necessarily right away and not necessarily in each moment. It's going to make you feel what you feel. And that is a positive thing, actually. But oftentimes I'll have people tell me, well, I meditated, I was paying attention, and I was doing everything correctly. And then this thought came up about, let's say, a person that I really miss, or about something bad that happened. And then I kept perseverating on it. And if I hadn't meditated, then it wouldn't have ruined my day and it wouldn't have put me in this state of mind. But another way to look at it is actually the act of meditation and the act of paying attention to your feelings and thoughts is clearly bringing to surface something that needs to be worked out, something that needs to be processed. And so gaining that curiosity about what's going on is going to help you process it, or determine, hey, I might need, again, to talk to a counselor, to talk to a loved one about it. I might need to journal about it. Maybe that'll get, some of these feelings out and make me feel a little bit lighter. So, and again, as we do that, we're freeing up brain space, we're freeing up emotional space to perform highly, to do what we need to do cognitively, mentally, and so on. But we're also regulating our emotions, because we're not just kind of like randomly being a victim to whatever arises. We're actually like tuning in and saying, okay, give me what you've got, and then dealing with it. Okay, so now we're going to do our multitasking exercise. Does anyone want to volunteer? And I promise you, it's not going to be anything bad. It literally is what I have here on the screen. And if not, I'll be the volunteer. I'll do it. I just thought it might be fun for someone who hadn't done it before.
Do we have anybody who wants to step up? Any good people who think they're good multitaskers who want to try this?
I'll go for it. I like to tout myself as a multitasker, and I feel like I'm about to get called out on that real quick.
All right, perfect. So I'm actually just going to set thank you, Michael, for volunteering. I'm going to set my timer, my stopwatch, so that I can time you, and we'll see how you do. Okay. So for the first part of the exercise, I want you to say the first 10 letters of the alphabet as quickly as possible. And then right after, without a break, counting to 10 as quickly as possible. And then I'm going to stop when you're done, and then we'll do the next part. Okay. Ready, set, go.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All
right. 7.46 seconds. Okay. 7.46. All right. Now, awesome job. Now, I want you to do the same, but I want you to alternate between numbers and letters. So it's going to go A1, B2, and so on. Okay.
Oh boy. All right. Yeah.
All right. Ready, set, go.
A1, B2, C3, D4, E5, F6, G7, H8, I9, J10.
Awesome. Okay. 13.30 seconds. Actually, your ratio was pretty good. So I will say you're a better multitasker than most, even though obviously when you were multitasking, you were still almost twice the time. But I will say you're a better multitasker than most, because usually when I've done this with people, or even based on, there was a study published a few years back, there was something about a 4 times difference. So let's say if your first time was 7 seconds, then hypothetically your second time would have been like 28 seconds or so. So you're better than most, but still.
That's all I needed today. That's all I needed to hear. I'm gonna leave that back.
but still see, there's, still that difference between when you were just on the numbers and just on the letters versus when you had to go back and forth. And it's challenging. It's a harder exercise than you think, right? So
100%. It totally I thought I was gonna be able to fly through that alternate, and I was just like, oh my God, I don't know the alphabet.
right. No, exactly. Yeah. And I will tell you, just to make you feel even better, I learned this exercise at a conference with other doctors. It was like an internal medicine conference. It was like this huge conference. And I went into this talk, and they made us all do this. And it was like, I mean, everybody just failed miserably. So, so no, you did a great job, but it is harder. It's definitely harder when we're flipping back and forth. And so when you can imagine, let's say, if you're, answering an email, but you're also on the phone with someone, or you're, like writing, whatever it may be that you're doing as part of your daily job, the more you're switching tasks, the more you're going to increase the amount of time that you do those tasks. And I know that in a lot of, in our society, right, it's so expected that we return that text right away, we return emails right away and whatnot. But it may be helpful to think about, for the sake of, again, improving your efficiency and really kind of making your days shorter ultimately, because if you can get the same amount of work done in a lesser period of time, you're allowing more time for restoration and for other activities. And so if you are able to create certain blocks of time, and some people will do this, a block of time where, okay, I'm checking my emails from this to that time, from this to that time, or removing certain notifications. I mean, I've removed pretty much all notifications from my phone, just so that we're not distracted. Because again, even the tiniest mental distraction, okay, where was I in the alphabet, right? And it's like, it just sort of, it's just how our brains work.
I definitely, sorry to interrupt. I definitely agree with you, especially on the notifications thing. I did the same thing early on in quarantine, especially at the height of like a lot of the bad stuff, like police brutality and all this crazy stuff going on. And I would like dive so deep into it that every notification I got, it just stressed me out more and more and more.
Right. It was like, oh my gosh, what happened now? Right.
Yeah. It got to the point, literally my therapist was like, turn off your notifications
Right.
altogether, like nothing. Just have a blank phone.
Right. Exactly.
It definitely helped.
Yeah. Good. I'm glad to hear. Yeah, no, absolutely. We don't maybe necessarily realize it at the time, but even when we think about, engaging in social media, or when we engage, or even in Netflix or whatever, right? Their purpose is to keep us on there as long as possible. And so it's going to be, hey, read this headline. Hey, look at this new thing that just came out, or, but if we're trying to do that and something else, or if we're shifting from this post to that post to this, it's really confusing to our brain. Like, we're just simply not meant to go that quickly. And it's overwhelming. All right, so being in the present moment. So I wanted to share again another study and another estimate as well. So how often are we really in the present moment, right? So it's estimated that our brains produce as many as 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day. And what's interesting is that over 95% of these thoughts are repeated daily, and they reflect our beliefs, right? So if your belief is, I'm not good enough, or I'm not this or that, or I'll never achieve A, B, and C, or whatever it is, they're more likely to be repeated daily. And these thoughts are ultimately going to be embedded and become beliefs. And our beliefs are ultimately going to guide how we behave, how we act in the world, which is then going to be reflected in how people behave towards us, which is then going to shape what our potential is out there in the world, right? So it originates here, but then it kind of embodies us and becomes an action, which is then how other people see us, which then really basically paves the way for our future and the road ahead. So it's really, really important to be aware of those thoughts, which is again why mindfulness, awareness, being in the moment and challenging, and not judging ourselves for the thoughts that we have that might be not so productive, because we all have them. It's normal, but really more getting curious about them, and also making note of just as many, if not more, ideally more, positive things about ourselves. So there's a great thing called the 5-minute journal, which you can get on Amazon. And what it is, basically, it's like a very structured journal that literally you can do in like 5 minutes every day, where it asks you about, like, what are the 3 great things that happened today? Or what did I do really well today? Or what's a positive thing that, so it's just all about how do we get you to pay attention in this moment to things that are nourishing to you, to things that are positive feedback, to things that are going to, be embedded in positive beliefs about ourselves that are then going to positively affect us. And then again, the kind of a little bit more abstract, right? But thinking about how do we cultivate that connection to our overall meaning and purpose in life as they relate to the present moment. So let's say you may be doing a mundane task, but it might be really, really aligned with what you want to do. You might be, cleaning your place, but it's like, but this is aligned with my meaning and purpose, because I like to live in a nice and clean environment. And this is, again, a positive contribution towards that meaning and purpose. And then the non-judgment piece, this is more difficult, I think, than the other two, because our tendency is to judge, and evolutionarily, we just are built to judge. And it's interesting, they did this study at Princeton where they gave people cards of pictures of people, and they somehow were able to estimate that the study subjects were able to create first impressions within a fraction of a second, within a 1/10 of a second, based on the photographs of the people that they were seeing. And then interestingly, those impressions correlate with impressions created if given more time. So we're very quick to judge. The good thing is, though, judgments generally tend to be kind of on the right track. But just being aware of how we're judging. Are we judging by saying, well, this is good, this is bad? Whether it relates to, let's say, our food habits, right? Like, oh no, I had a piece of chocolate cake, that's so bad. Well, not necessarily. If you had it once in a while, and if you decide, and if you really felt like having that cake, no, go for it. Like, what a positive thing. But so it's really all about how we frame it, right? So just being aware of those judgments and saying, do I really believe that? Do I really think that? And allowing yourself to question it. And I'll just share a couple of studies here just to illustrate how doable this is. But again, as mindfulness relates to cognitive performance, they did one study where they had, for 8 weeks, they had a group where they taught them to do mindful breath awareness. And then they had a control group where they didn't do that. They found that the subjects that were doing this mindful breath awareness after 8 weeks had improved indicators of attention and memory compared to controls. So 8 weeks, that's all. Another study that was done for 16 weeks of only 10 minutes a day. Now, anyone can carve out 10 minutes a day of a mindfulness practice, improves attention and ability to process conflicting information. So what about mindfulness and mental health, right? Because we talked about mental health is really a prerequisite to optimal cognitive and mental performance. So this large study that looked at a number of different studies that were done found that mindfulness meditation improves anxiety, depression, as well as pain. And what's interesting, I included this here, this study about improving pain perception, just because, again, pain can be physical, but it can also be emotional pain. This specific study was done on physical pain, and it was found that, it's a very, very small study, but it was found that long-term meditators who were exposed to a pain stimulus, like a painful stimulus, reported less unpleasantness of the pain than these new meditators. So it's illustrating that it's possible, after cultivating mindfulness for a long time, that your perception of something that normally would be negative, painful, can actually improve over time. So you still may be aware, hey, this is a painful experience, but it's less unpleasant to you. You're able to process it differently. So breathing, I know we had done a breathing exercise in the past, which is the 4-7-8 breath, which I'm happy to send the link for that for anybody who is interested. But just a couple of things about breathing. Breathing is generally kind of the easiest way to get into paying attention mindfully to the present moment. And there is evidence that certain breathing exercises have the potential to reduce anxiety. And I've actually even found this clinically. I've been able to help people reduce anxiety and panic attacks by just using breathing exercises as they feel anxiety or as they feel panic attack emerging. Also, yoga, that of course combines breathing exercises, is also able to help reduce anxiety, increase resiliency to stress, and also improves insomnia. And sleep is very important, of course. And here is and if you're interested in the demo, it's drwild.com for this specific 4-7-8 breath. And these are the instructions. All right. So nutrition. So what do we eat for brain health, right? What we put in our body is just as important as the thoughts and beliefs that we have when it comes to optimizing our brain health, our cognitive health. So a lot of the studies that were done here with nutrition, they look at people's cognitive ability in older age, or they look at, preventing dementia. And so the group of studies is a little bit different from specifically peak performance, but it's really looking at how do we over time prevent decline in our cognition, which we can then say, okay, well, likely this is also going to help us optimally act cognitively. So Mediterranean diet really has the most evidence when it comes to cognitive ability and maintaining that. So basically a plant-rich diet with specifically plants rich in polyphenols, which I'll mention what they are, and anti-inflammatory foods are important for brain health and for preventing that cognitive decline. So we want to include a lot of vegetables, all colors of the rainbow, right? Because they indicate different plant nutrients, fruit, legumes, nuts, whole grains, because these are all full of antioxidants, polyphenols, as well as other phytonutrients or phytochemicals, as well as unsaturated fatty acids. And then in animal studies, actually, these nutrients also enhance new nerve formation in the brain, and they strengthen certain synapses in the brain. And they also enhance survival of neurons and reduce inflammation and oxidative stress. So it's really important to feed our body and our brain foods that are going to reduce the process that naturally occurs as we accumulate more oxidative stress and inflammation in the body, right? We need to be able to fight that. So specifically, what do we want to eat? A lot of citrus fruits, grapes, berries, all kinds of berries, especially blueberries, cocoa, nuts, green teas, and coffee if you tolerate coffee. Also, there haven't been great studies on this, but this is just something that I see in clinic time and time again. For a percentage of the population, gluten seems to be a problem. And it's thought to be in part because of how we harvest gluten-containing plants, because of how we hybridize them, actually, just how they've changed over the years, as well as how gluten-containing products are being made. And so while there aren't any studies really showing a clear relationship, I've certainly noticed that some individuals that are sensitive to gluten report brain fog and mood symptoms that resolve when gluten is eliminated from diet. It's one of those things where there's no one size fits all. I generally say to my patients, if I do suspect that gluten may be a problem, I generally suggest an elimination diet of anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks. Let's see how we do if we eliminate gluten. How do we feel before versus after? And then determine if this is something that we advise long-term. So if this is something that you suspect may be a problem for you, definitely talk to your doctor or a registered dietitian. But it is something that I've anecdotally seen makes a difference. Another really interesting thing, I found this study where they used a Swedish mixed berry beverage, but I wasn't able to find the actual beverage. They actually made it for the study, but it doesn't look like they sell it anywhere. But basically what they used in the berry beverage, they used blueberries, strawberries, elderberries. There's some sort of Swedish berries called lindenberries or something like that that are like very tart. And they used tomato powder. And in this particular drink, so I suppose anyone can make this kind of drink at home, but in this particular drink, and so it was really high in polyphenols and carotenoids, right? So people drank this for 5 weeks, and it found that it improved working memory in 50 to 70-year-old otherwise healthy adults, right? So again, something that we can all do. We can certainly up our berry and tomato intake. All right, so what about sleep? So we know that sleep is good for us, but what does it really have to do with cognition and whatnot? So poor sleep has been linked to poor cognitive performance and poor performance in terms of memory. What's interesting though, there's certain part of our cognition, like rule-based reasoning and decision-making and planning, that can be relatively unaffected by sleep loss. Now, what's interesting, more creative and innovative aspects of our cognition seem to get worse with lack of sleep. So it almost seems that, you know, our brain and our body kind of tries to preserve, okay, even if we don't get enough sleep, we need to be able to like reason, make decisions and plan just to stay safe and to survive. But then when you talk about that extra layer of mental performance, such as creativity, innovation, that just goes away when we don't sleep enough. And then the studies also found that some of these cognitive abilities, if you don't get enough sleep, you can't restore them by simply, you know, drinking coffee. They really just aren't gonna be there unless you're getting enough sleep. And so, of course, we also know that emotions are important when it comes to cognitive performance. And it's been found that attention, learning, perception, and problem solving are all affected with an emotional imbalance. And then what's interesting when we think about kind of longer term effects, sleep also protects against age-related cognitive decline as well. So how much sleep is enough? So generally studies say 7 to 9 hours for young adults and just generally adults. And then for older adults, 7 to 8 hours of sleep is generally enough. Again, everybody is different, but those are just the general guidelines. So now what about exercise? So moderate to vigorous physical activity is associated with improved cognition, academic performance in children, as well as these standardized test scores that look at our neurology and psychology. What's interesting though, because most studies have been done in children when it comes to academic performance and in older adults when it comes to preventing dementia and cognitive decline, I didn't find a whole lot of research and recommendations for just adults, like young adults, middle-aged adults. There's really not a whole lot of information. We think, however, that resistance and aerobic training likely play a role, again, especially in adults over 50. Interestingly, some of the studies point to potentially a greater effect in women. Again, I don't know that we necessarily have enough evidence to support that. But again, not enough evidence in literature. Again, that being said, definitely important to exercise both aerobic and resistance. We just don't have a great way of quantifying how that affects our cognitive performance. Now, what about yoga? So practicing hatha yoga regularly is shown to create greater connectivity between different parts of the brain, and as well as to cause positive changes in the brain's learning and memory center. So our brain can be better connected, which is again, better emotional regulation, better cognitive capacity, but also better learning and memory with yoga. And then also long-term yoga practice for 8 years or more has been associated with this increased of thickness of this part of the brain called the cortex, the cerebral cortex, in regions of the brain that play a role in intelligence, goal setting, memory, and emotions. And again, this particular study was done in women over 60. So again, a little bit of a like more specific age group. So what about creativity? So creativity, the way that it's described is essentially how we're able to relate and associate different things that are seemingly unrelated. This is where creativity is sparked from. So cultivating creativity, of course, we know is important for our overall performance, but also for our just general social life. And emotional regulation also plays an important role here, right? And you can imagine if you're anxious, if you're stressed out, creativity is going to go down. But positive emotional states and cognitive flexibility also support creativity. So again, it's really important, again, balancing mood in order to step into that creativity. And then interestingly, engaging in music or other creative processes, other creative arts may slow down cognitive impairment down the road. So that's another thing about creativity. Now, training our brain, I mentioned a couple of modalities that, again, I'm happy to talk to you about it more if you're interested, but one is called neurofeedback and the other one is called HeartMath, which is a biofeedback tool. So the general principle of neurofeedback is it's a biofeedback device, meaning that it takes some sort of measurements, in this case, our brain waves, and then runs it through a system. And then based on that, our brain gets feedback, and this trains our brain, and this targets our brainwave patterns. So what happens is this is used to optimize mental as well as emotional performance. And so what happens is our brainwave patterns are being picked up through EEG sensors that are put on different parts of our scalp. And then we get real-time feedback through these audio cues that occur when your brain is about to change states. And this trains your brain to be in certain wavelength brainwave patterns. It's something that can be done. Some therapists do this, but it's also something that can be done at home. There's a way to get the device either rented or purchased for home use. And then it's something that you can do at home. And the audio cues kind of sound like somebody's like scratch. It's strange. It's kind of like either like somebody's scratching like a record, or it just like these brief micro stops as the whatever the melody is that goes on. And that apparently retrains I've tried it several times, but that apparently kind of resets whatever your brain was going to do and trains your brain to stay in a certain wave pattern or to be in a certain wave pattern, which then ultimately translates to mental and emotional regulation. And then HeartMath is another biofeedback tool. And interestingly, HeartMath looks at our pulse. So what we do with the HeartMath, there's a little device that just goes onto the earlobe here. And that essentially tracks your pulse. And that information goes into your phone where you download the HeartMath app. It's called Inner Balance. And the app is giving you visual cues for when to take a breath in and when to breathe out. And you follow these visual cues while this information about your heart rate is going in. And what it's telling you based on how you're breathing and how you're following these cues and what your heart rate is, it's giving you a pattern of something called heart rate variability, which greater heart rate variability is actually a reflection of good health. So it provides you with that pattern and it provides you with those cues. And ultimately the goal is that you are able to, with your breathing, that you're able to regulate your nervous system, which in turn regulates your heart rate, which then ultimately results in improved memory, improved focus, sleep, emotional regulation, anxiety, as well as energy levels. And I love that tool. I've used it before and periodically still use it, and it's wonderful. Now, I know we're pretty much running out of time. I was going to go through a few supplements for brain health, but I'm happy to also pause for questions, and we can just kind of, take it from there or discuss the rest at another time.
Why don't we pause for questions right now? Because I know we're at time and I'm sure people have some questions because you've given us so much good information as usual. And I just want to make sure we have time for whoever has an inquiry to be able to ask.
Perfect.
Does anybody have questions? Feel free to unmute yourselves. Anyone? Okay, maybe we don't have any questions. I
Wait, I have a question.
Mhm.
I
Right.
know I may have missed most of this early on, but I
Mhm.
know you had mentioned something about gut health and how that helps with the cognitive approach. As someone that has a slew of different like stomach problems and gut health issues, what would you say is kind of I guess the correlation outside of the obvious
Mm.
factors of like pain, and then just what are or what would you say is like one supplement you would recommend that I could potentially use?
That's a great question. So, yeah, so this is a big topic, and I'm happy to kind of dive deeper into it, with another lecture, because I do have a full lecture on the gut brain connection. But
Oh,
but just briefly, one of the what's hypothesized to be kind of the most important connection between the gut and the brain is the connection through the vagus nerve. And our vagus nerve is part of our parasympathetic nervous system. And basically, in our gut, we also have, of course, the part of our nervous system is in our gut, because we're able to sense things, and we're able to sense toxins, and we're able to sense pain and danger and inflammation, infection, and so on. But what happens is when we sense danger or toxins or inflammation in the gut, that information gets sent up to our brain, and that can influence how we feel. It can influence certainly how we perceive pain, but if it can also influence our mood. It can also influence a number of different symptoms. But what's also interesting is that research has been done on bacteria in the gut, and how different profiles, and lack of, in kind of very simplistically, kind of lack of bacterial diversity in the gut may have something to do with mood, because we know that when we supplement with certain lactobacillus species, for example, what happens is there is a lowering of anxiety, and so on. And so I'll just leave you with one thing: serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, which is important for the brain, and which is thought to be behind anxiety and depression. Serotonin is also produced and present in high amounts in the gut. And our bacteria are also really important when it comes to neurotransmitter regulation and so on. So there's felt to be a connection through the gut microbiome, the gut bacteria, but also through our nervous system that connects our nervous system in the gut as well as our brain. In terms of supplements, it's hard to pinpoint a specific one, because there's so much in terms of gut health optimization. But generally, what I tell people, a lot of the principles that we're talking about here also apply to the gut. So when we think about like that Mediterranean diet, and when we think about a plant-rich diet, that 100% applies to the gut. In certain circumstances, of course, certain elimination diets have to be followed. Or gluten was one example that I mentioned, where some people are just sensitive to gluten, and it has adverse effects on them, even if they don't have celiac disease. But so diet is very important, but also cultivating that healthy gut microbiome. So for some people, obviously, the most desirable way is to cultivate that microbiome through the gut, or through what we eat. But then the other one is through, certain probiotics. One specific probiotic that I have in mind that is specifically targeted for that gut-brain axis is called GBX by Claire. Claire is the company, and Claire with a K, Klare, and it's GBX probiotic, like gut-brain axis. If you search it, you should be able to find it. With that, again, depending on the type of gut issues that are at hand, some people don't tolerate probiotics very well. So I can't make a specific recommendation, but that is one probiotic that's been used for the gut-brain connection.
oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm definitely going to look into it.
Yeah, no worries.
Anybody else? Any last questions? Well, thank you so, so much, Dr. Boyana. This was so good. I feel like the stress level you hit on so many things that we've been talking about in 360 and in our own businesses. And so I think this was a very much needed session. And I'm so glad for you guys to all be part of it. And people who are watching later will enjoy it too. So thank you.
Awesome. You're so welcome. It was such a pleasure. And we can certainly continue next time so that I get to tell you guys all about the supplements and yeah.
Perfect. Thank
Great.
you, everyone. And we'll see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.
Wonderful. Bye. Take care.